There was once an open expanse, but having no boundaries, it had no awareness of itself. Then it became fenced in and thus aware of itself. But now it has begun to yearn for its original openness. For what reasons? God only knows. Some say that thoughts are not real and only have value insofar as they represent things that are. Yet those who say such never seem interested in turning this notion onto what they have just said about it. Such as these are similar to those who fret over man's ability to mislead and misuse Mother Nature. No matter their education or glibness of tongue, minds driven along such lines lack any meaningful understanding of life. 'Tis myopic snakes who bite their own tails and take it to be successful attacks on intruders. Who is to assail thought but thought? And who but the lamest among them will undertake such a fruitless task? Hormones are community-minded, and so are most men's neurons. It is those of transcendental outlook who are exceptions to this. In the simple world, imitation is the sincerest form of self-protection. There seems but two areas about which you can speak of man attempting change: in the way he behaves and in the way he thinks. Feeling does not enter here, in that he believes that the way he feels is determined by some combination of his behavior and thinking. So he's faced with the twin possibilities of trying to change the way he acts or the way he thinks. And I invite you now to take the time to consider which of these two is the more dominantly pursued and discussed. More dominant, in fact, to the point of being near exclusive. And once that is clearly seen, ask yourself further, why is it this way? And now for today's fairy tale. There was once a world in which, when they told tales of magical powers, it was always about an increase in understanding, not an increase in physical abilities. The dreams of men should not be the dreams of men, yet routinely continue to be so. But on what are we herein reflecting, if not man's instinctive mental urge to change? And without acting specifically in this area, what ultimately separates him from the unthinking beast of the wild, who only know the life of behavior? One plain, simple fact is superior to 1,000 beautiful, complex metaphors. But when it comes to the kinds of facts needed by the would-be mystic, they must apparently be first run through the metaphorical filter to become assimilable. In spite of his protestations to the contrary, it is the sound of traffic that makes an ordinary man's life on the porch bearable. When you know of only one place to stand, who can run the risk of going insane by trying to move somewhere new? A man who had read and studied on such matters one day stopped and thought, why have all peoples always had not only stories of gods, but also of men entering into combat with the gods, which on its face, based on their own descriptions of the gods, would be an obviously foolish and futile undertaking? He began to consider the possibilities of what the gods might unwittingly actually represent to man. There was once a small group of elephants whose brains, for some reason, began to develop beyond the pachyderm norm, and they began to think. Soon they started to reflect on the fact that they existed, and began concocting ever-increasingly complex theories, models, and myths to explain how they came to be and what their special purpose might be. After some years in this effort, one of them one day was moved to say to the herd, do you realize that we're becoming just like those creatures who used to follow us around with guns and cameras? Hormones and the feral are experts in the question of purpose. while neurons are on thinking about it. Herein, by the way, was the inspiration for the concept of the beneficial division of labor. The mystical warrior's tip of the day: you're not in the right state of mind if you're open to attack. Or, only a man lost is vulnerable to accusations of being lost. Which, if he was sharp enough, itself would give hint as to where he is. During one little people's day, when anyone could come to court and speak to the king, one commoner approached and asked him, "Are some men inherently superior to others?" And the ruler, secretly observing his own personal tell the truth day, replied, "I'm not the one to ask about that." If you're right, I believe I'm catching on to what you're doing. When you talk about kings and other people, you're not really talking about other people. In another universe, a man who knows what he's talking about can talk about anything. The pieces of a puzzle never want the puzzle explained. Well, not if they're ordinary, sane, and decent pieces. One legend of such a dubious and disturbing nature as to surely be spurious says there was once a mystical order which taught of 3 stages of enlightenment. It said that the first stage was just that, an initial enlightenment, and that after that comes a long, gradual stage, wherein one thinks and talks about the first stage incessantly for a really long time, and that the third stage is when you just can't think or talk about it anymore, and that this is the final stage of enlightenment. Okay, still not sufficiently upset? Try this. Fact. All myths and legends about the great mystical quest, which are pleasant and reassuring, were made up by people who didn't have a clue. No time to be depressed. Hey, you're right. On your last show, you read an item entitled Diet and the Secret, wherein you said that the secret does not reveal itself to those who eat too much or eat too little. May I assume that you were not referring to food? And another viewer writes, "Do you write all the letters from viewers except this one?" Man's thinking is the only animal yet identified on this planet which will walk up to an openly baited and set trap and ask the trap, "Should I step in?" And a fax just in from a viewer. Earlier in the program you said that the pieces of a puzzle never want the puzzle explained if they're ordinary and sane pieces. But isn't what you meant that they never want the puzzle explained unless they're suicidal? My demographics people have been telling me that the quality of our audience is improving. The mayor of a thriving city proclaimed, "Not only are all possible solutions to our problems irrational, but, worse than that, they could potentially work so well as to be disastrous." If you're right, I think I'm beginning to catch on. You often put enlightened words into the mouths of those inherently not. Least anyone gets shortchanged around here. There's yet another thing that distinguishes man from the other beast. He is the only creature who will lend his lame foot to another of his species. A physician from another world once visited here and went away with one question: why, amongst men, is sickness contagious, but not its opposite? The mind indeed is a curious thing, in fact, doubly so, in that it cannot be understood and men can't see that it can't. So let's clear up the opening statement. When you don't pay for what you get, you can't be shortchanged. In his will, the king bequeathed to the people this statement. All political, social, and economic theories are but attempts to hide greed and desire for power. But the prince found it and destroyed it, and the kingdom rolled on. Another blatant shadow of the secret, peeking out from under the skirts of local reality, is what should be the publicly obvious fact that those who want to save the world cannot save themselves. To the more conscious, there's only one way to spell futile, and pointless needs no synonym. One man's motto was, everybody knows what it is, it's just nobody wants to face it. In that singular intellectual world of man, everything starts out as a good idea, and even those things that don't, if they stay around long enough, someone will begin to find them to be so. There used to be this guy who theorized that man's ignorance is what inspired the concept of the eternal. To think that any salvation or regeneration comes from without is to have no conception of the container that life comes in. Man's misconstruing of the above, by the way, was the original inspiration for the idea of take-out food. All mystics know that you've got to eat at home. And this fact's just in from a viewer concerning an earlier item. You said that those who want to save the world cannot save themselves. But hidden therein is there not also the deeper message that anyone who believes that the world needs saving, by so believing, offers unquestionable proof that they understand nothing anyway? One reason there's so much said about man is basically because there is so little to be said. On a certain distant planet, their homes for the mentally defective harbor only those who can be insulted. There's no place like home, what? Said a cerebellum to a thalamus. In this one land, every time the king would think about abdicating the throne, he was stopped by his suspicion that if he did, it would be immediately seized upon by some preposition. There's no place like home where one belongs, what? Said an out to an about. The speaker so addressed his audience: we fear, distrust, and sometimes dislike the unconscious mind because we do not know what is in it. And a man in the crowd, who it happened was familiar with his, mused, hey, that's nothing compared to the thing you have when you do know. A viewer writes that having lost some interest in religion and petitions to a supreme being, that he has adopted something from a man he heard mentioned in one of our recent stories, and that now, when circumstances warrant, in place of his previous prayers to God for assistance, he simply says, could you help me out here, Hubert? And with, he adds, about the same degree of success. One father's comment to a son: to be concerned about wealth is the same as being concerned about reputation. And to be concerned about reputation is the same as being concerned about power. And to be concerned about power is the same as being concerned about death. And to be concerned about death is the same as not being concerned to the fullest degree possible about how to live your life mentally to the max. It is the intellectual fare of man, by the way, that inspired menus to include the notice, no substitutions allowed. Which again, I note, is another reason mystics eat in. Though obviously unrealized by those involved, men upset over world events are like adults critical of the intellectual level of kids' TV shows. One guy says to tell you that his motto is, If you don't think about it, you can't worry about it. He says that you'll know what he's talking about. Once learned beyond a certain point, the more alert need no dictionary, language instruction, lessons in logic, or any other forms of routine education. They have an awareness of the merry-go-round. A is to Z as nothing is infinity, and all that man knows not is standing right beside him. The intellectual world of man in this universe is this universe's only example of self-contained cannibalism. That is somehow yet self-sustaining. The enlightened know this. Those still chewing on their foot do not. Those who do not realize the abode of the secret to be within, and thus search for it arduously without, are perforce subject to uncertainty and a troubled mind. Those who cry out, "Here, here, it's over here," do so to help console themselves and to conceal the fact that they have not been able to locate where it is. Any enlightenment is ultimately self-enlightenment, but you need help to get there, and that help comes from life. When it comes to the world of ideas, the grass always looks greener in another yard for a very good reason. It is. As P.T. said to Barnum, "Don't say I never gave you nothing." The challenge put yet another way. How is a living ocean to ever stop the sound of crashing waves? The king's personal sage one day so advised the ruler, "To be alive is to be continually on the verge of sickness. To be alive is to be on the way to death. And to be alive is to be forever uncertain and frustrated." And the king asked, "But which of them is the worst?" To which the sage replied, "You tell me." For a long time did the ruler ponder this question, and came to this decision. To be alive in the ordinary state of mind is to be most concerned with conditions unavoidable, while, for whatever reason, ignoring those that might be otherwise. The captive bear suffers from the blows of his captor, but by whose hand does man's mind come to pain? How indeed is a living ocean ever to stop the sound of its own crashing waves? The difference between advanced thinking and the ordinary kind, as present, for instance, in psychology, philosophy, and religion, is that the latter all concern themselves with man's behavior, while a wild animal trainer could serve the same purpose just as well. Both the body and the mind collect information, but only the mind talks about it, and in so doing both expands and diminishes it. Hint, hint, silent, silence, Flagomire, Flagomire. A little bit about what we were talking about last time. As complicated as it got, I'm sure this won't help those who found it having gotten complicated. But that I took several stories that I had read here and pushed them even deeper by pretending that viewers had written in asking questions about the two stories, so as to put it even a third arm's length away from any possibility of ordinary comprehension. But if you recall, one of them had to do with the story of the guy who won a physique contest and when interviewed attributed his success to the great genes he had inherited from his parents and his own hard work. And that someone supposedly wrote in, and someone who believed that they got something from the story wrote in and said, "Well, isn't everything genetic?" And I had supposedly the person who told the story originally, respond to the questionnaire by saying, I'm not saying yes or no to your question, but I can't answer it. I'm not going to answer it because it is far too close to the secret itself for me to make such a simple response. What is wrong with a simple response if there is an answer? If there is an actual answer. And I could have said, as some of you probably already suspect, that the questionnaire in my made-up example actually presented the question rhetorically, because they had at least partially already made up their own mind. And they said, well, but isn't everything genetic? Tie that also, you remember, with the story I gave you that of my fictitious, I think he was real, wasn't he? But at any rate, reputable, renowned psychologist who was ready to present a paper stating his reputation on all of the research that he had done in one area, that he had come to the conclusion, unavoidably, unconditionally, that, and I just made up one example, human aggression is entirely genetic in nature. And then I went on to make up the example that even after he got through saying that to you, we're staying there talking to him, that the phone rang and he goes over and finds out that one of his colleagues has blocked his promotion and its collateral salary increase. And he becomes very enraged. He becomes hostile, in other words. He gets aggressive. But it's on the basis that it was something that someone did to him based upon their prior experiences together. Because he says, oh, I know how Dr. So-and-so. He never forgot that time I did so-and-so. He now has become aggressive, and I was pointing out as a side effect to that is how everyone outside of any given system can assail the system, can excuse themselves from having any interest or faith therein by the simple fact that all followers of all systems, psychology being a system, that all followers of all system, no matter how strongly they support it theoretically, which is to say mentally, they cannot support it to the same degree behaviorally. And therefore it is open that all Christians can accuse all Jews of being hypocritical, and all Jews can accuse all Muslims of being hypocritical. Everybody can accuse everybody else, and it does not have to be that specific. It has to be an orthodox, recognized religion, but everyone can accuse everyone else of being hypocritical. Everyone can say, well, listen, you talk a good dance, but you can't do the step. Kids tell their parents that. The time they get old enough that they might be able to run away from home or at least dodge the old man's fist. And he says, I told you not to smoke. I told you not to fool around with dope. And the kid goes, well, you get drunk every night. It excuses, in the full sense of the word, but it leaves people that there is nothing to depend on. Then they have to defend also their own system, whatever it is upon which they depend, all the way from religion to some sense of nationalism, to a reliance upon their ties apparently to a blood family, because no one's mind, no one's thinking matches their behavior. And I could have done you a disservice or possibly a service by putting it in that order rather than saying no one's behavior matches their mind. If your behavior matches your thinking, you're uncivilized. Nowadays it would be hard, it'd be difficult to find anyone that there would be a perfect balance between their behavior and what they think. But the closer it comes to it, the less a man is civilized. If you recall someone some time back, I brought up an example of people, they continue to ponder how can, in the midst of civilization, in our day and time, they think it's different now, but how can a person, in the midst of an area such as we live in here in Belgium, how can somebody walk down the street or walk into a coffee shop and go, "What do you mean you don't have any mocha today?" and shoot 5 people in the coffee shop. You know, what were they thinking? Is the normal question that comes about. What were they thinking? Well, the people who asked that, again, let me point out, we're talking about an apparent dichotomy. We're talking about an apparent division that I keep insisting does not really exist discreetly between a man's thinking. At the level of consciousness, through my drawing of the human nervous system, from the cortical level up, and looking at that as being man's mental life, and from here down being his physical instinctive life. And I keep insisting that it's just an ad hoc division, etc. But I could be saying that to make you feel better. There could be such a discrete division. So here we go. I said maybe. The question about how can someone act in such an uncivilized, despicable, cold-blooded way to shoot 5 innocent people. It always helps if one of them was a pregnant woman and one of them was a 10-month-old kid. Maybe one was a priest, a nun. But anyway, the question is, what were they thinking? Over a cup of coffee. The question is, or the answer is, that the more they behave in such a way, the less any thought was involved. But also notice this. The more that someone deals in thinking rather than behavior, they're the ones more likely to say, how can that be? Because those of a more similar cut to my fictitious gunman, the kinds of people from his same background, maybe his same neighborhood, when they hear about it, it's hardly worth a shrug. They go, "Oh yeah?" They go on about their business. If you ask them, go, "Wait a minute, you just seem to shrug off that this guy you know," which is not the real point, but that helps the story also. You know this guy. Maybe it's their brother. How about this? They find the guy's brother and say, he walked in and ordered a cup of coffee and they didn't have his flavor, and he just suddenly went, "Well, goddamn," and he pulled out a damn 9mm and killed 4 people, including a pregnant woman and a helpless child. And his brother goes, They go, "Well, what do you think about that?" You understand, I'm insinuating that he is of a similar cut than the gunman, that they're more interested, that they live more at the instinctive level than compared to the mental level. To him, there's very little to think about. He is no more surprised by it than he displayed by going, and started to walk off. The more you think, the more you live by the life you believe, by the way. We'll get to that in a minute. The more you believe that you're being led by the light of thought as opposed to just brute, unthinking behavior, then the more you have these kind of philosophical, deep questions that, well, they bother some people so badly. I know you find it hard to believe. It bothers some people so badly that they write books about it. I know. I mean, it frightens me too, but there it is. Where I started with this, by the way, if you recall, was that no one's thinking matches their behavior completely. Because if it did, you would be totally uncivilized. Because if it did, you would be no more than truly an illusionary beast. Because you would be like a lion who could think, but still acted no differently than the lion next to him. That's what you would be if you're thinking, if your theories, if all of your philosophies of life, if they matched perfectly your behavior. You understand? It's the same thing. If you could succeed wherein all people seem subject to be attacked for failing, that is to say, well, you talk a good game. You talk about loving your fellow man. You talk about doing this and that. You just said that you are absolutely convinced that all human aggression is genetically based, and you just let circumstances, just what you perceive to be circumstances that had nothing to do with genetics, based upon circumstantial evidence, based upon the experience between you and some other human. You did not see that this aggression, you did not see it in your case as being genetic. 2 seconds later, you saw it as being based upon experience. You see it being based upon or subject to that man's control. So there he is. He is a sitting duck to be accused of, well, you say one thing. But also, if you recall, there was a purpose that I insisted that as much as humans normally do, that we are not subtracting from this psychologist's thinking any iota of sincerity. That is, when he says that he has spent 10 years in specific research, every spare moment, in investigating the nature of human aggression, and that he is now absolutely convinced that it is entirely genetically based, as much as an ordinary human mind can be absolutely certain of anything, I'm giving him that credit. You understand? That's not the point. It has nothing to do with what follows after that. It has nothing to do with the fact that he says he is absolutely convinced. And if there was in some way, if we had a new kind of magical technology wherein we could take a scan of some man's brain, when we said, all right, now lay here and stick your head in this thing, and let me ask you, you are absolutely convinced that all human aggression is genetically based, yes or no? And he goes, yes. And it scans in such a way, we'll make it simple, since we're simple people, that it flashes green if all of his brain cells, that every brain cell, every neural connection that heard that question and participated in the answer, which was yes, that every one of them agreed. That if you looked at it as being some sort of parliament up here, then every neural connection that heard it and responded, they all voted yes. Every single one of them. That's not the point, though. But keep that in mind, and he still turns right around within seconds and behaves in a way absolutely antipodal to what he absolutely believed. But there's nothing strange about that. There's no irony involved. There's no sarcasm involved. Because I repeat, I'm not going to stay here, but if you can see this, some of you I think did real quickly, if you found someone to the contrary whose behavior absolutely matched his thinking, whatever it was, whoever he was, the man would be a danger. And the easiest way to describe him was, he'd either be insane, if that helps you to start. That's not the best description. The best description is he would simply be uncivilized. That's the only way that behavior and thinking will perfectly match. Is you're to the level that thinking is, to say the very least, minimal. That's the only way. Because thinking and behavior, as soon as Adam could think, as soon as he could speak, I'll read through the story, the Western version again. Another, I guess I've hit parts of this from this angle, but the whole idea of the original sin, the tree of knowledge, you could look at it as simply that Adam began to think. It's what the tree of knowledge represented. That something told him, in the Western version, God said, don't eat the fruit on the tree of knowledge. And so he ate the tree of knowledge, and then the story doesn't try to go any further into it because it was enough that men even made up that much. Had to wait around for somebody like me to fill in the blanks. Well, they didn't have to. That's all they wanted to know was the point. So they didn't. But you could look at from one of several versions, interpretations, usefully, not theoretically. But the tree of knowledge and his eating thereof, his partaking thereof, simply represent that he began to think. And once you begin to think, you're driven from paradise. Things are no longer easy. It's no longer you and somebody else laying around all day eating and screwing and just sleeping. Once you begin to think, then, as Robert Preston would say, you got trouble. You got trouble right here in River Eden, Eden City. So the idea that no one, even the most religious, even the most intellectual amongst us, cannot behave in a way that perfectly matches their thinking, that is a child sticking out his tongue at the Empire State Building or at the whole educational system because he has to go to school. There's no way. I just tried to make it as silly as possible. It is certainly not seen amongst ordinary people as being a childish endeavor. It is seen at certain levels. It can be childish, of course, like a kid going, I don't want to play anyway, and nobody won't let him on a team. It can go all the way from that, though, to much higher sophisticated levels wherein the critique, the reasonable, well-founded, scientifically based critique of another's ideas and philosophies is not only acceptable, it is oftentimes quite genuine, or accepted as being genuine evidence of one's insight. So everyone is open to critique. Whoever wins the Nobel Prize in philosophy this year, part of it had to have been won on their attack on some opposing school, some school other than their own, of thought. That is part of what keeps the self-sustaining cannibalism that is man's intellectual life self-sustaining, because he never runs out of food. Every time he eats his own foot, he grows another foot. And if he doesn't grow another foot, somebody else does, and he chews on it. By the time he chews it off, somebody else shows up with a brand new foot. And somebody, of course, is chewing on his foot at the same time. But it keeps it all alive. That is tied to what I was trying to turn your head toward, about the fact that even if there were a simple answer, a simple yes or no answer to a question that seemed to have some far-reaching ramifications, which I'm implying it does, since I made up the damn story and then made up a story about the story. And now I'm doing a story about the story about the story, and that is the guy who asked the mystic who told the story about the winner of the physique contest. He thought about, well, wait a minute. And he thought he pieced some things together. That means piece some things together. That the winner attributed his success to two things: the great genes he inherited from his parents and his own hard work. In the original story also, if you recall, the mystic says it's a shame that there was not a reporter around of the sort to ask him also, what's the source, you think, that drove you to work so hard? All right, now in this third telling at least, the man in the story, the man who wrote to me about the story, that thought he got something from it and went, well, isn't everything genetic? Because you understand, without me saying it simply, it should be obvious enough. I'm just not going to say the sentence. I'm not going to describe what he thought. He thought he had put together from the story of the physique contest winner, attributing to two obvious sources his victory: the genes he inherited, the good, robust, big-boned genes from his parents, and his own hard work. And then the mystic who told that story said, it's a shame nobody asked him, well, what do you think motivated you to do this hard work? So the guy who wrote me about the story then, I'm not going to say it for him or for you, you're supposed to see though, he kind of put that together and went, now I'm not even going to say what he thought. But you can figure it out. Based upon that, then he asked the mystic, he said, well, yeah, but hey, isn't everything genetic? The mystic would have actually done him a disservice to even say nothing and walk away, because he would have interpreted that as being some kind of response. So the mystic engaged evidently in his own let's tell the truth day, and said to the man, I am not going to answer. I cannot answer that yes or no. And I am not inferring that you are correct or incorrect. But it's too close to the secret itself for me to engage in such a simple, direct response. See, I know it sounds like I'm repeating some of this, not literally. But it's getting to the point that not only is it valid in the story of the mystic saying, well, it's getting too close to this kind of area, it's getting too close to the secret itself for me to give a simple response. My now third layer piled upon this is getting too close, so I'm trying to get you to see, it's getting so close that I'm about running out of anything new to say about it, but it shall not stop me. Ask yourself, what is the danger? If there's a question that seems to have some potential transcendental significance, which, let's for the sake of our discussion, agree that that question does. I'm not saying it does, but let's say it does. That, well, isn't everything genetic? Because if the answer is yes, and if you could hear the answer is yes, if thoughts actually had some discrete, if each individual thought had some discrete ability to influence people, if it carried along its own individual reality, That is, if there is such a thing as a true statement, that is, that you could tell somebody when somebody says, well, I always thought that that was green. You go, I'm sorry, but if you're interested, that is yellow. And they were actually looking at it, and they said, well, all my life I call that green. You go, well, pardon me, but if you're interested, yes. By the way, that color is yellow. And the words, the idea, that color is yellow, if that would just hit somebody's, and them go, my God, I never realized it. Which, of course, is what the mind believes when it doesn't think about it. Which is when? Can you spell all the time? But if there was such a thing as ideas that in themselves had the irrepressible, unavoidable impact of the truth that men like to think. Well, there's certain things that are true, and you just tell somebody and they got to hear it. You go, I told some people. You told some people they didn't hear it, and they go, well, there's something, they're heathens or they're stupid. But that does not, that's just why I was saying the mind refused to see it. And you can say, but you said, like religious people, scientists do it. They just think they're in a better class. Some of them, a lot of them do dress better, I guess, or worse. But at any rate, religious people and scientists, they continue to like to believe. The religious are easier to hold up as an example to most people. They'll say, well, God says so-and-so. His word is immutable law. And what he says is it. Doesn't matter what we little piddly humans think. What he says is a fact, and here it is I've got in writing. And you go, so, when God says something, that's it. They go, yes. So, nobody can deny it. Who can deny the Word of God? You go, well, how come it is you got on street corners, or you got a church, or a synagogue, and you preach this, and you tell people that, and I see some of them go to sleep, or I see some of them just seem to be involuntarily when you're saying, God does not want men to fool around on their wives. And while you were saying that the other day, I saw several people, their involuntary muscles, their subconscious mind made their heads go. In other words, there were people in there who disagreed with you with the Word of God. How can that be? And of course, then they have to move it very shortly, which the human mind, if it is not facile and agile, it is nothing. No. Which one man says that the ability of the mind is the original, or was the original inspiration for Scatman Carruthers and the Ritz Brothers and all forms of tap dancing. But I don't know. The mind can immediately, when you go, well, wait, you just said that there are certain things in life, and scientists would say, well, they're scientific facts. They're scientific laws. That it doesn't matter whether you agree with them or not. The law of gravity, that if or the law of opposing force, Newton's second law of motion. And you go, and a scientist says, it's a fact. It doesn't matter whether you like it. I can't imagine why nobody would like it, but you can say, well, I don't like it, or you can say, I don't agree with it. But it does not change the fact of the fact. It has its own life. It has its own self-proving validity. And you say, well, how come you told those students that and somebody wanted to argue with you? It's harder to imagine than it is to say, well, somebody's talking about a religious matter, what God wants. That is, they start out and say, well, here's an idea. That ideas are possible, facts are possible, but statements are possible that are within themselves, unconditionally, true. Irrefutably so. And you say, well, how come is it that you can repeat that to somebody, and half the time people go, you're full of shit. You're crazy. And the guy goes, well, that's because they're crazy. Religious people have other stories. Scientists would just say, well, I don't know. I guess they're ignorant. I didn't know that they were that illiterate. Of course, I was about to do my little thing that you would think, well, if there's any potential a man could use his mind in a fashion he'd never thought about, you almost like to take him gingerly, with no hostility, and grab him around the throat and say, could you by any chance bring back to your memory just the last 30 seconds what's happened, what you said? Do you think you might find it of interest? And probably, especially somebody with a higher degree of education, will go, let me go! So, of course, the religious guy would probably try to kick you in your privates. But either way, neither one of them will fool with it. Of course, if you want to move it up to a fourth level, don't take that as being irony. Because you can say, well, hey, now that proves it. No, it doesn't. You're back in the same, you're just a different example. back to the rhetorical part that I was positing or offering to you again, was if there were such a thing, which I think, or I hope I've covered part of your possible response, if there is such a thing as a simple, all-inclusive, unconditional answer to a question, an important question. What men consider important question, not just is this yellow, and you go, yeah. But the kind of question, is not everything genetic? Presented to someone would know the answer, if there is an answer, and it does have the kind of significance that I am granting it for the sake of our discussion, that the truth of that, a true understanding, a proper understanding of that question, is not everything genetic, is dangerously useful, dangerously enlightening, theoretically, just for the sake of our discussion. So if it is, we're assuming, we're taking this as being a more important question is, Dan, is it raining outside? Or is that shirt actually yellow? Is everything genetic? And so it's yes or no. And if I'm inferring that it does have, theoretically, very significant ramifications, why would not someone who apparently knows the answer it? If anyone is waiting for a punchline to that, exhale now, because I think I'll skip right along. I receive a fair amount of questions on this basis, and sometimes in my made-up stories, I know I drag in, and of course manhandle in a nice fashion, reported figures of, I can remember Mozart, Plato, Leonardo, P.T. Barnum. All right, the last part was funny. But anyway, I get questions regarding this, and it's not just to me. I've heard them presented out in more mundane public forums, and that is what it amounts to is this, is there's some correlation between genius and interest in things mystical. And it normally arises, or I'll get a letter, somebody mentioned to me after sometime I've mentioned a Mozart or something in a story. Or for those of you of different taste, Wilson Pickett or J.B. I want to give you a full range. And some of you may know this. It is not uncommon, and I'm using genius right now in the ordinary use of the word. I'm not implying anything on my own. Just what ordinary people call genius, the kinds of geniuses that educated, sophisticated, normally sane men and women have always selected historically. We're not about to try some inclusive list, but you could start with, the Aristotles and St. Augustine, and Chaucer, or Erasmus, or Kant, Descartes, Goethe, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Mozart, Beethoven, Wagner. I didn't mean to short anybody in any particular arts, but anybody else that comes to your mind that is considered to be, that historically, if you were taking a course, undergraduate, if you're taking a course in college on the geniuses of history, and they tried to cover all bases, at least in the arts, leave out politics and warfare, but in the arts, any of those in there, it's quite common, if you read enough history, if there was enough history written, to find, in many cases it wasn't hidden in the least, that many of them did have an interest in what they considered to be things mystical. Some of Mozart's symphonies. Well, I'm not going to start on the people. I don't mean to single out anybody in particular, but it's not uncommon for them to have tried to paint, have written stories, novels they considered to be metaphorical, to their philosophy, even though they may have been, first and foremost, considered to be an intellectual and a real thinker in the classical sense of being a philosopher, but that many of them still would say that they can't help but believe, they can't help but suspect that there might be more to life than even a mind such as mine can imagine. plenty of painters have used it as subjects. From most of the Middle Ages on in the Western world, it's been in the religious context, but it was still not just literally biblical in the Christian sense, but you had all these painters always doing these things with the Madonna and pictures of crucifixion that had all kinds of strange quirks to it that nothing in the New Testament, none of the history or the Old Testament, but the New Testament especially. In other words, you could see that they had thrown in something. And it would seem to be some validity to the fact that if someone is a genius, again, I'm just using the ordinary sense, a Shakespeare, someone who can apparently write that which seems to display the internal workings of such a diverse number of people, which I would suggest to you is the basis whether they ever recognize that in English lit or out in the ordinary world. I know that he had a nice way with words. You can appreciate his words the same way as a Mozart's sonata, his use of language. But I would also submit to you that the basis of his real recognition throughout the world, even through translations into other languages wherein he has lost the aforementioned verbal talent, linguistic talent, that he was able to a striking degree to apparently have some insight into a wide range of different personalities. Because if you never thought about it, those of you who read fiction or drama, an ordinary genius, Tennessee Williams or whoever, Cervantes, if they write 2 or 3 plays, 2 or 3 works, they're normally good for one magnum opus. And after that, if they have semi-magnum opusi, it's still, they change the names of the characters and they try to change the settings. That's always one of the dead giveaways. If their first hit was about a truck driver in New Orleans, and then 5 years later they finally come out with their second blockbuster, you can count on it being about a plumber in Japan. They will get as far away from the original, and for very good reason. Do I have to tell you why? Because they're going to end up writing about that same goddamn plumber in New Orleans, but the guy changed his name now from Jethro to Young Sing, and try and read up a little bit on how things were in Japan, so that it doesn't sound like the same thing because the man doesn't know it, but he's aware of the fact he's writing the same character. Shakespeare seemed to have an unusual ability. So I'm saying that. And then a Mozart. I'm just trying to give you some example of still using I'm not giving it it's not dependent upon my twist or my just instant interpretation of the cause for Shakespeare's continued popularity. But by any ordinary contention, he is still a genius, without my little aside. And I was going to give one more example of a Mozart. That not only is his music, people like music consider it beautiful, but the man could sit down and be in need of money, or just suddenly realize he'd be sitting there drinking a beer or something. Somebody said, "Do you realize you were supposed today is Prince William's wife's birthday, and you promised him you took 50 pounds or guilders in advance 6 months ago to write a birthday symphony for her?" Him go, "Oh shit!" And he would sit there while still talking, people talking around him and shooting pool, and he'd borrow some paper and sit there in his head and write a 45-minute symphony. Write it through with no editing, no nothing. And go, "What time is it? Are we late?" And go over to Prince William's palace and go and give him a story like, "This is the hardest work I have ever done. For 6 months I've done," but hand it to him. All right, that kind of genius. Again, besides, I'm just giving it some credit, trying to give you a little more reason for people asking the question, is there not some connection between genius? Because I'm saying it not only, to use just those 2 examples, and I can't go any more, it's not important, but that Shakespeare is not only popular because he seemed to be a good storyteller. Mozart's not only popular or considered to be a genius just because millions of people still go, "Boy, I like hearing that." It's beyond that they had there's not just he wrote stuff that people like. There seems to be a great deal more. Because Carole King or somebody wrote 2 or 3 songs that people like nowadays. And no offense to her music or anybody you want to pick out, some contemporary, Neil Sedaka, Lennon McCartney. But I would be, don't go be taking any long odds on the fact that their kind of music will have the same kind of popularity 200 years after their death as Mozart's died. That there seems to be more to it is the point. And so they call him a genius. I guess it's good I ran to end the tape, because some of you may be disappointed there's no real big punchline to this. If I had started earlier, I could have, well, there are other things I could say, but I did want to point this out because it has more significance, or should to a few of you, than the answer to the question, or my concluding comment regarding the question itself, which is there some connection between genius and having an interest in things mystical? My answer is this. They are two different things. But now I set up all that to point out that not only by their own admission and their own claims did many of the world's geniuses, many of them claim to have an interest in things mystical. That doesn't matter. But the question still seems to fit. That, well, if you're that big of a genius, if you had that kind of intellect, surely you'd be interested, whether they call it mystical or not, but interested in some further expansion, some transcendental possibility of the workings of the human mind. If they were an Einstein, surely they would. Well, maybe they did. But here's the point. It's two different things. I said there was no real punchline to this, but here it is. There's the answer to the question. That is there no connection? They're two entirely different things. Now, if there is a punchline, it's this. It's what I keep pointing out to you. That there's no amount of thinking, of whatever kind. So I know plenty of you have always added your own immediate. It was your involuntary reflex to add some condition. When I say no amount of thinking will lead to enlightenment, there's no way to think yourself to the secret. Then I know everyone's mind, they take, well, that's in part metaphorical, or maybe even symbolic, or you added your own, but, blah, 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 blah. The workings of the intellect, and the reason I even brought up the question regarding the example of genius, is no matter what level. Because people, ordinary minds consider that an Einstein or a Goethe or a Shakespeare, that their mind, that their consciousness, their awareness is operating another level. No, it's not. After I told you all that. Mozart was no more aware of what was going on. Mozart was no more conscious, regardless of the fact that plenty of musicians that might even not like his music, but they'd probably cough 2 or 3 fingers just to have that kind of musical genius that they could sit down and write out, could hear a 12-piece orchestra playing something that takes 45 minutes and sit there, and out of their brain they just run and they just almost transcribe it. Other ordinary minds ascribe to that genius, like down there metaphysical itself. That's almost mystical. No, it's not. Because if you could jump in Mozart, if we could put him in my machine to see what was going on in his mind, or say, how can you do this? And he was forced to tell the truth, you go, I don't know. But see, ordinary people think, well, now wait a minute, there's a great deal of difference even between that, and if I turned around right now and started to pick up something and tripped and fell over this stool, if I was going over to pick up and tripped over it, and somebody said, how in the hell could you trip over a stool right there in the middle of the stage? And you go, I don't know. Yeah, but there's a great deal of difference between that and people asking Michelangelo, how did you learn? How can you sculpt like that when we understand you never had a lesson? Nope. I could do it. Well, how do you explain it? I don't know. That's genius. Geniuses normally have at least enough sense, or at least an agent nowadays, to keep them from ever saying that. But intellectual wherewithal, even at the level considered to be by ordinary minds, genius is a complete other game than things mystical. We out?